The star chart was wrong, and Navigator First Class Ressa Vey knew it 7 minutes before anyone else on the bridge of the TFS Crucible Dawn. She did not announce it. She ran the numbers twice, cross-referencing the real-time positional feed from the ship's graviton array against the Kethara Compact's navigational database, the one the Kethara had transmitted 6 hours ago as part of their formal request for military escort through the Veylorn Passage. The Compact's chart showed a clear corridor, 11.4 light-minutes of open space between the Veylorn dust shelf and the Athery Shoal, wide enough for a convoy of 216 ships to transit in standard formation at 0.3 subluminal. No hazards, no anomalies. Certified by 14 successive Kethara, survey sweeps across 200 years of regular use. Vey's instruments told a different story. The Graviton Array, a system unique to the Crucible Dawn, the first ship in the Terran fleet to carry the new deep-field sensor package, was painting something in the corridor that the Kethara charts did not show. Not a mass, not a debris field, not a stellar body or rogue planetesimal. Something the sensors registered as a pattern of graviton interference extending across the full width of the corridor in a lattice of overlapping nodes, each node precisely 12,000 kilometers from its nearest neighbor, the whole structure spanning the corridor from dust shelf to shoal like a net strung across a river. A net that had not been there 6 hours ago. Vey had been sitting at this console for 14 hours. The Crucible Dawn was 31 days out of Dawnbreak Yards, the newest warship in the Terran fleet, her hull still carrying the chemical tang of fresh sealant and uncured thermal ablative. She was a Waymaker-class fleet carrier, 1,900 meters, 4.2 million tons displacement, designed from the keel up as a deep space escort platform for exactly the kind of mission they were flying, shepherding Allied convoys through contested or unstable corridor space. The ship was so new that the crew still got lost in the lower engineering decks, and the wardroom chairs had that particular stiffness of furniture no one had sat in enough times to break in. Commander Ilara Han occupied the command chair with the careful posture of an officer who had been given a ship she had not yet learned to trust. 6 months of shakedown cruise had not been enough. The Crucible Dawn had systems that no other Terran vessel carried, capabilities that existed as theory in engineering manuals and had not yet been tested under fire. Han was 44, lean, quiet-voiced, and carried the particular wariness of a captain who had lost a ship before the destroyer TFS Kellen Bridge, 9 years ago, to a reactor fault that killed 11 of her crew and left her with burned scars along her left forearm that she never covered. Navigator, status on the Kethara convoy. Convoy is formed and holding at Rally Point Tessic 4, Commander. 216 vessels. Lead element is the Kethara diplomatic cruiser vessel of lasting accord, flagship of compact liaison Dreshan Var. Convoy speed is 0.3 subluminal, transit time to the far side of the Veylorn Passage estimated at 47 minutes. And the corridor. Vey hesitated. It was a small hesitation, 0.3 of a second, perhaps less, but on the bridge of a warship, hesitation was its own announcement. Han's eyes moved to her. So did the eyes of Weapons Officer Pel Andric, a broad-shouldered man who had served on 4 warships and never seen one this quiet. So did the eyes of Communications Officer Talon Rowe, who was 26 and on her first deep space posting, and still believed that warships went to war, rather than to the slow, procedural dance of escort duty and Allied diplomacy that was the actual substance of most naval careers. The corridor reads clear on the Kethara charts, Vey said. My instruments disagree. Han did not move. Explain. Vey transferred the graviton array overlay to the main tactical display. The bridge crew watched the lattice resolve, a web of interference nodes spread across the 11 light-minute corridor, each node a pinprick of graviton distortion, the entire structure invisible to every sensor system aboard the Crucible Dawn except the deep field array. Standard electromagnetic sensors saw nothing. Thermal sensors saw nothing. Mass detectors saw nothing. Only the graviton array, calibrated to detect variations in the local gravitational constant at scales below 1 part per trillion, could see the lattice. And it was perfect. Every node equidistant. Every connection geometrically precise. The mathematical regularity of a structure that had been placed, not grown. "That is not natural," Han said. "No, Commander, and it wasn't there 6 hours ago. The Cathara survey sweep certified this corridor at 11:40 today. The lattice appeared on my instruments at approximately 1600. It is still expanding. I'm tracking new nodes forming at the perimeter at a rate of 1 every 9 minutes. Han stood. She did it the way she did everything, without drama, with the economy of a woman who had already been through the worst thing that could happen to a captain, and now measured every subsequent crisis against the sound of her crew screaming in a burning corridor. What does it do? I don't know. It's not radiating. It's not moving. It's not interacting with any known field or particle. It is altering the local gravitational constant within each node by a factor of 0.003. That's below the threshold of any standard navigational sensor. A ship transiting the corridor at 0.3 subluminal would not detect the lattice until it was already inside. And then, unknown, but the graviton distortion pattern is consistent with a perceptual interference array. The nodes aren't generating force. They're generating a field that would interact with neural tissue. Any organic nervous system passing through the lattice would experience gravitational microfluctuations at a frequency that maps to the delta wave band of most known species brain activity. Andrick spoke for the first time. "You're saying it's a weapon that attacks the mind." "I'm saying it's a structure that would interfere with neural function across any species whose cognition relies on electrochemical signaling, which is every species we've encountered." The bridge absorbed this. Rose's hands were motionless on her communications console. Andrick's jaw had set into the particular configuration of a man who was already thinking about firing solutions. Han was looking at the lattice the way Vey had seen her look at damage reports, not with fear, but with the cold arithmetic of consequence. "The Cathara convoy," Han said. 216 ships, how many crew?" "Approximately 41,000 crew across the convoy, plus 11,000 civilian passengers, settlers, and trade delegation members bound for the Athery colonial zone. 52,000 people, and the convoy is scheduled to enter the corridor in how long?" Vey checked, 7 minutes and 41 seconds. Han turned to communications. "Ro, hail the Cathara convoy flagship. Priority 1. Tell them to hold position and do not enter the corridor." Ro's hands moved, then stopped. She looked up with the expression of someone who had just walked into a door that should not have been there. "Commander, I can't raise the convoy. Comms are..." She checked her board again. "Communications are clear on all standard frequencies. The equipment is functioning, but the Cathara flagship is not responding to any hail. Neither is any other vessel in the convoy." "Are they transmitting?" "Yes, standard convoy coordination traffic, navigation updates, speed confirmations. They're talking to each other. They just aren't hearing us." Vey felt the cold settle. Not the cold of space, the cold of a problem she recognized. She pulled the communications frequency analysis and overlaid it against the graviton lattice. The match was immediate. The lattice nodes were generating graviton interference at a frequency that precisely canceled the carrier wave of Terran standard communications. Not Cathara comms, those operated on a different carrier band, derived from the compact's own physics. Only Terran frequencies were being suppressed. The lattice was not a random phenomenon. It was not a natural formation. It was a weapon, and it had been calibrated specifically to silence the Crucible Dawn. "Commander," Vey said, "the Lattice is jamming us. It's targeting our communications frequencies specifically. The Cathara can still talk to each other, they just can't hear us, and their sensors can't detect the Lattice. They are going to fly directly into it in 6 minutes and 50 seconds. Han processed this in the span of 2 heartbeats. Helm, intercept course on the Cathara convoy, maximum sublight acceleration. Get us in front of them before they reach the corridor entrance. Commander, at maximum acceleration, we can reach the convoy's lead element in 4 minutes, but we'll be inside the Lattice perimeter by then. Understood. Navigator, what happens to us if we enter the Lattice? Vey had already run the calculation. The graviton interference will affect our crew. Human neural tissue is susceptible to the same delta wave disruption. At 0.3 subluminal transit speed, symptoms would onset within 90 seconds of entering the Lattice: disorientation, perceptual distortion, loss of spatial awareness. Full cognitive disruption within 3 minutes. The crew would be effectively incapacitated. All of us. All organic personnel. The automated systems would continue to function, but without crew to operate them, the ship would be on autopilot navigation, weapons, damage control, all running on pre-programmed parameters with no one at the controls. Han looked at Vey for a long moment. It was not a look of command. It was the look of one human being recognizing another's math and accepting the answer it produced. Can you navigate us through the Lattice with the automated systems? I can program a course through the Lattice that avoids the densest node clusters. It won't prevent exposure entirely. The field extends between the nodes, but I can reduce the intensity by routing us through the interference nulls. Crew exposure would be reduced by approximately 60%. 60% still means 40% cognitive disruption. Yes, Commander, some of the crew will be affected, probably everyone to some degree. The bridge crew will have to function through it. Can you? Vey thought about this for exactly 1 second. She was 32 years old. She had graduated first in her class from the Terran Navigation Academy. She had served on 3 warships and never once lost a vessel she was responsible for guiding. She had a particular gift, not talent, which was innate, but skill, which was built through 10,000 hours of practice, for holding a navigational picture in her head while everything around her was going wrong. She had done it during the Tessark Nebula transit, when the astrogation computer failed, and she hand-plotted a course through 7 light towers of ionized dust using backup instruments and trigonometry. She had done it during the Cassara evacuation, when she guided 64 civilian transports through a contested corridor, while 3 hostile flotillas tried to cut them off. She could hold a navigational picture the way some people could hold a melody complete, 3-dimensional, alive in her mind, even when the instruments went dark. Could she do it while her own brain was being scrambled? I can try, she said. Han nodded. Helm, intercept course. All hands prepare for neural disruption conditions. Medical, stand by for cognitive impairment across the crew. Weapons, I want the point defense grid on automated if we lose bridge control. And navigator, Han's voice dropped, not in volume but in register, the way a voice drops when it stops being a command and becomes a request between equals. Get those people out of the corridor. The Crucible Dawn surged forward. 4.2 million tons of brand new warship, accelerating at rates that pushed the inertial dampeners to the edge of their design tolerance. The hull groaning with the particular sound of a ship that had never been asked to do this before and was discovering, in real time, whether its engineering was equal to its specifications. Vey felt the acceleration press her into her seat despite the dampeners. A phantom weight that was not quite physical, the ghost of 12 gravities translated into a gentle pressure by systems that were running at 97% of their rated capacity for the first time outside of dock trials. She was programming the course as they accelerated. The Lattice overlay glowed on her console, a web of interference nodes, each one a small sphere of graviton distortion, the spaces between them the interference nulls where the field was weakest. She plotted the course the way she had been trained, not as a line through space, but as a four-dimensional trajectory accounting for the ship's velocity, the lattice's expansion rate, the convoy's approach vector, and the time remaining before 52,000 people flew into a weapon designed to destroy their minds. 6 minutes and 12 seconds. Commander, the lattice is still expanding. New nodes are forming ahead of us. Whatever is generating this structure is still active. Can you identify the source? They swept the graviton array to maximum range. The lattice extended across the full corridor, 11.4 light-minutes of interference nodes, thousands of them, each one precisely positioned. At the edges of the array's range, she detected something else. Not a node, something larger, a graviton signature that dwarfed every node in the lattice the way a sun dwarfed the planets orbiting it. It was behind the Athery shoal, hidden from direct observation by the mass of the shoal itself. But the graviton array could see its shadow, the distortion it cast on the local gravitational field, the way a massive object warps the fabric of space around it. I have something, behind the Athery shoal, single source. Graviton displacement consistent with she stopped, checked the numbers, ran them again. Consistent with a vessel or structure of approximately 19 million tons. That's 4 times our displacement. A ship, or a station, or a weapon platform. I can't resolve it. The shoal blocks direct observation, but it is the source of the lattice. The interference pattern originates from that location. Han's voice was very calm. A 19 million ton vessel hiding behind a stellar formation, generating a mind-attack lattice across the only corridor that a Cathara convoy can use to reach the colonies, while specifically jamming Terran communications so that the one ship that can detect it cannot warn anyone. Yes, Commander. This was planned. Yes. For the Cathara. For the Cathara, or for us, or for both. 5 minutes and 9 seconds. They could see the convoy now on long-range sensors. 216 vessels in standard transit formation, a column of ships stretching 40,000 kilometers, the diplomatic cruiser vessel of lasting accord at the head, the heavy cargo carriers in the middle, the lighter transports at the tail. They were moving at 0.3 subluminal, steady, confident, following charts that showed a clear corridor and no reason to stop. They had no graviton array. They had no deep field sensors. They had standard navigational equipment designed by Cathara engineers, who had been surveying this corridor for 2 centuries, and had never once encountered anything that required instruments more sensitive than what they carried. They were flying blind into a trap. Helm time to intercept. 3 minutes 40 seconds at current acceleration, Commander. Navigator, what's our exposure window once we enter the lattice? They had the calculation ready. If we transit the lattice at maximum sublight, we'll be inside the field for approximately 11 minutes. At the 60% reduced intensity along the interference nulls, crew cognitive function should remain above operational threshold for the first 4 to 5 minutes. After that, degradation will be progressive. By minute 8, most crew will be severely impaired. By minute 11, we'll be running on automated systems alone. And the course you've plotted through the nulls, will it hold for 11 minutes? No, the lattice is expanding. The nulls are shifting. I'll have to replot continuously. They paused. By hand. The navigation computer can't process graviton array data fast enough to track the null positions in real time. I'll need to hold the navigational picture and update the Helm inputs manually every 15 to 20 seconds. Through 11 minutes of neural disruption. Yes. Han was quiet for 3 seconds. Then, is there anyone else aboard who can do that? They thought of her navigation team, 6 officers and 12 enlisted, all trained, all competent. none of whom had spent 10,000 hours learning to hold a four-dimensional navigational picture in their head while the universe tried to take it away. The skill was not common. It was not teachable in the way that mathematics or procedures were teachable. It was the product of a particular kind of mind, one that could hold complexity under stress the way a pressure hull held atmosphere through structural integrity, not effort. "No, Commander." "Then this is on you." "Yes." 3 minutes and 41 seconds. The Crucible Dawn crossed the convoy's projected path and swung to face the oncoming formation. They felt the ship shudder as the helm reversed thrust, a full-stop maneuver that pressed the inertial dampeners past their design envelope and sent a tremor through the hull that she felt in her teeth. The ship settled. Ahead of them, visible now on the forward display, the Cathara convoy approached at .3 subliminal, a wall of ships, the vessel of lasting accord leading, its hull painted in the gold and cobalt of the Cathara compact, its running lights steady, its course unwavering. "Row, try every frequency, every protocol. Cathara diplomatic, Cathara military, Cathara emergency, universal distress, light flash, everything." Row's hands blurred across her console. All frequencies attempted. No response. "Commander, they're not ignoring us. The Lattice is canceling every outbound signal we transmit. We're screaming into a dead channel." "Navigator, can we physically block them? Put the Crucible Dawn in their path?" They ran the intercept geometry. "We can position ourselves directly ahead of the convoy's lead element. The vessel of lasting accord will have to alter course to avoid collision, but the convoy behind it will need at least 90 seconds to react and adjust at their closing speed. The trailing elements won't be able to stop before entering the Lattice." "How many will enter?" "At minimum, the first 40 to 50 vessels, 8 to 10,000 crew and passengers." Han's jaw tightened. "Do it, put us in front of the flagship, and fire the forward signal array, not a communications burst, a navigation hazard beacon, maximum power. Even if they can't hear our voice, they should detect a navigational warning." They programmed the intercept. The Crucible Dawn pivoted, her bow swinging to align with the approaching convoy. The signal array fired a navigational hazard beacon, the maritime equivalent warning that translated across every known species instrumentation as danger ahead, stop. It was not a communication. It was a pulse, a brute force electromagnetic shout that did not require a carrier wave to convey its meaning. 2 minutes and 14 seconds. The vessel of lasting accord did not alter course. Its navigation officer had seen the Crucible Dawn's beacon. They knew the electromagnetic pulse would have registered on every sensor aboard the Cathara flagship. But the Cathara compact was a species that had been using this corridor for 200 years. Their charts showed it clear. Their own instruments showed it clear. And the Terran warship blocking their path was new, untested, operating on instruments the Cathara had never seen and did not understand. Compact Liaison Dreshanvar would have received the beacon, consulted the charts, checked the Cathara sensors, and concluded that the human ship was malfunctioning. They could imagine the conversation on the Cathara bridge. The calm voice of the navigation officer reporting no hazard detected. The diplomatic liaison checking the protocol for responding to a Terran navigational warning when Cathara instruments contradicted it. The cultural certainty of a species that had built these charts over centuries and trusted them the way humans trusted gravity, not as a belief, but as a fact. "They're not stopping," Rose said. "Navigator, how long until they reach the Lattice perimeter?" 1 minute 42 seconds. "Commander, I recommend we begin our transit now. If we enter the Lattice ahead of the convoy, I can use the Crucible Dawn's graviton array as a relay, broadcast the interference pattern data on a frequency the Lattice can't cancel. The Cathara instruments can't detect the Lattice directly, but if I feed them the graviton data in a format their systems can process, their navigation officers will see it." You said entering the Lattice would start degrading the crew in 4 to 5 minutes. Yes. And you need 11 minutes to transit. I need 7 minutes to reach the convoy's lead element and broadcast the graviton data. If they stop, the rest is irrelevant. 7 minutes and 41 seconds, Vey corrected herself. The precision automatic, the navigator's instinct that refused to round a number that might mean the difference between a ship saved and a ship lost. That's the window. Han turned to the bridge crew. All hands, neural disruption conditions in 60 seconds. Secure all stations for automated operation. Medical, I want stimulant packs at every bridge position. This ship is going into the Lattice, and we are going to stay functional long enough to warn that convoy. Navigator has the con for navigation. My orders stand until countermanded by me personally if I become incapacitated. Navigator Vey has tactical authority. Vey felt the weight of those words settle on her shoulders like a physical thing. Tactical authority. On a ship she had served aboard for 31 days, whose captain had just handed her the lives of 312 crew and 52,000 people in a convoy that did not know it was about to die. She entered the Lattice. The first node passed over the hull at 16:14 hours and 17 seconds. Vey marked the time because she knew she would need to track it, because the degradation curve was measured in minutes and seconds, and her ability to hold the navigational picture would decay on a timeline she needed to understand as precisely as she understood the course itself. The first minute was manageable, a faint sense of unreality, as though the bridge had shifted slightly on its axis, not physically, but perceptually, the way a room shifts when you stand too quickly. The instruments were steady. The course was clean. Vey held the graviton array overlay on her console and watched the null paths shift as the Lattice expanded around them, recalculating the Helm inputs every 18 seconds, threading the crucible dawn through the narrow gaps where the interference was weakest. The second minute brought the first real symptom. The numbers on her console blurred. Not physically, her eyes were fine, but the meaning behind the numbers slipped, the way a word repeated too many times dissolves into sound without content. She had to concentrate to read a bearing. She had to actively reconstruct the navigational picture that normally existed in her mind as effortlessly as her own name. Around her, the bridge crew was beginning to feel it. Andrik's hands had gone to the edges of his console, gripping the frame with a force that whitened his knuckles. Ro was blinking rapidly, her mouth slightly open, the expression of someone who has forgotten what they were about to say. Han sat rigid in the command chair, her eyes fixed on the forward display, her breathing controlled with the deliberate precision of a woman who was using every technique she had learned in 30 years of service to keep her mind from sliding into the fog that was creeping through the bridge like cold water rising. Navigator, status. Han's voice was thinner. Not weaker, thinner, as though some of the overtones had been stripped away, leaving only the essential frequency. On course, 4 minutes to convoy lead element. I'm broadcasting the graviton data on wideband relay. The Cathara should be able to receive it in approximately 2 minutes. Are they stopping? Not yet. The third minute was when Vey started losing people. Chief Helmsman Derek Orland's hands went still on the controls. His eyes were open, but they were looking at something that was not the Helm display, something internal, something the Lattice was showing him that no one else could see. His inputs stopped. The ship began to drift off the null path. Vey grabbed the manual Helm override. She had never flown a Waymaker-class carrier. She had never flown anything larger than a destroyer simulator. But the controls were standard Terran layout, and the navigational picture in her head was still intact, fraying at the edges, losing resolution, but intact in the way that mattered. She knew where the nulls were. She knew where the nodes were. She could feel the Lattice in the graviton data, the way a sailor feels the current, not as abstract information, but as physical presence, a landscape of invisible walls and open channels that she navigated by instinct refined to reflex. She flew the ship. She held the course. She replotted every 15 seconds as the lattice shifted, each recalculation taking longer than the last because the numbers were harder to hold, harder to process. The mathematical relationships that she normally grasped instantly, now requiring conscious effort that felt like lifting something heavy with a weakening grip. For minutes, Rose slumped forward on her console. They heard the thud of the young officer's forehead hitting the edge of the communications board, and felt nothing, not because she did not care, but because the part of her mind that processed empathy was the same part the lattice was attacking, and she could not afford to use it. Andric was still functional. He had drawn his sidearm and placed it on the console beside his hand, not because he intended to shoot anyone, but because the weight of it, the physical reality of the weapon, was an anchor. Vey understood this instinctively. She pressed her palms flat against the console and focused on the temperature of the metal, the grain of the surface, the sensation of physical contact as an anchor against the dissolution the lattice was inducing. "Convoy lead element in 3 minutes," she said, and her own voice sounded distant, as though she were hearing it through water. 5 minutes. Han was speaking, but Vey could not process the words. The commander's voice had become a pattern of sounds without semantic content, the way a language you do not speak sounds recognizable as speech but empty of meaning. Vey was operating now on a level below conscious thought, the navigational picture running in her mind like a program that continued to execute even as the operating system crashed around it. The course, the nulls, the nodes, 15 seconds, recalculate, input. 15 seconds, recalculate, input. She was aware, in a distant and theoretical way, that she was crying. Not from fear or pain or grief, from the sheer neurological overload of a brain fighting to maintain function under conditions it was never designed to withstand. Tears ran down her cheeks, and she did not wipe them because her hands were on the helm, and the helm was the only thing that mattered. 6 minutes. The Crucible Dawn was inside the convoy's formation now. Vey could see the Cathara ships on the forward display massive cargo carriers, their hulls painted in the geometric patterns of Cathara trade registry, their running lights steady, their courses unchanged. They had not received the graviton data, or they had received it and could not interpret it, or they had interpreted it and did not believe it. 52,000 people were 3 minutes from flying into a weapon that would destroy their ability to think. Vey reached for the one thing she had not tried. The Crucible Dawn carried forward-mounted signal projectors designed for tactical coordination with Allied fleets, high-intensity directional beams that could cut through almost any interference. The Lattice was canceling standard communications frequencies, but the tactical projectors operated on a different band, a military specification that used modulated graviton pulses rather than electromagnetic carriers. The Lattice could not cancel graviton-based communications because the Lattice itself was a graviton structure. Canceling the signal would destabilize its own nodes. She activated the projector. It was not designed for this, not designed to carry navigational hazard data, not designed to interface with Cathara systems, not designed to do anything except coordinate weapons fire between Terran warships. But Vey rewired the output on the fly, her fingers moving with a precision that was not dexterity but desperation, repurposing the tactical projector's modulation protocol to carry a simple repeating message in the mathematical language that every spacefaring species understood. Prime number sequences encoding a hazard warning, followed by the graviton interference data, rendered as a mathematical pattern that any navigation officer of any species could read. She aimed it at the vessel of lasting accord and fired. For 4 seconds, nothing happened. The Cathara flagship continued on course. The convoy continued behind it. The Lattice continued to expand. Vey's vision had narrowed to a tunnel centered on her console, the edges of the bridge dissolving into gray static that she knew was not real but could not distinguish from reality. Her hands were shaking. The navigational picture in her head was fragmenting. She could hold the course for perhaps 2 more minutes before it dissolved entirely, and then the Crucible Dawn would drift into a node cluster, and 312 human minds would follow hers into the fog. Then the vessel of lasting accords running lights changed. Navigation warning strobes, red and amber, firing in the pattern that the Kethara used to signal all stop to a convoy. The flagship's engines reverse thrust. Behind it, one by one, the convoy vessels began to break cargo carriers dumping velocity, transports firing retro thrusters, the entire 216-ship formation decelerating in a cascade that rippled from front to rear like a wave breaking backward. They were stopping. Vey felt something release in her chest that she did not have a name for. Not relief, relief was too clean a word for what she felt. It was more like the sensation of a rope going slack after holding a weight so heavy that the hands holding it had gone numb. She became aware of the bridge around her. Roe was unconscious. Orlin was motionless at the helm, his eyes open and empty. Andric was on his knees beside his console, one hand still gripping the weapon he had anchored himself with, the other pressed against his temple. Han was in the command chair, her eyes closed, her breathing shallow. 7 minutes and 41 seconds. The Crucible Dawn emerged from the far side of the lattice at 16:21 hours and 58 seconds. Vey held the course for the final 30 seconds on muscle memory. Alone her conscious mind had already surrendered, the navigational picture gone, her awareness reduced to the mechanical act of holding the helm input steady, while the ship carried itself through the last interference null and into clear space. She did not remember the next 4 minutes. The medical team told her later that she had remained upright at her console for 90 seconds after clearing the lattice, her hands on the controls, her eyes open, her brain running on residual electrical patterns with no cognitive activity behind them, the neurological equivalent of an engine idling after the driver has left. Then she collapsed. When she woke, it was to the sound of Chief Medical Officer Danny's Pell arguing with someone outside the medical bay. The argument had the particular energy of a doctor who had been overruled, and intended to make the overruling as uncomfortable as possible for everyone involved. Navigator Vey needs 72 hours of neurological recovery minimum. I can show you the scans. The delta wave disruption caused microlesions in the temporal and parietal cortex. She is not cleared for duty. She's the only navigator who can read the graviton array. Han's voice, thin, tired, but carrying the command authority of a captain who had woken from her own bout of neural disruption 2 hours ago and had immediately returned to the bridge. The lattice is still active. The convoy is holding position, but they can't stay there indefinitely, and the source behind the Athery shoal hasn't moved. Vey sat up. The medical bay spun once, settled, and resolved into the too bright, too clean space of a ship that had never had casualties before and smelled of antiseptic and fresh panic. Her head felt like it had been packed with sand, not pain, exactly, but a thickness that made every thought feel like it was being pushed through a medium denser than air. "How many?" she asked. Han appeared in the doorway. She looked like she had aged 5 years. 3 dead, engineering specialist Wren, sensor tech Hollies, and crewman second-class Pieter Goss. The lattice caused seizures in crew with pre-existing neural conditions. Wren had an undiagnosed vascular malformation. Hollies had a prior concussion that made her vulnerable. Goss, Han stopped. Goss was 19. He was on his first posting. He died at his station in the lower sensor bay. Alone. Vey closed her eyes. 3 names. 3 people she had served with for 31 days on a ship, so knew that most of the crew were strangers to each other. 3 people who had died because a weapon they could not see had attacked minds they could not defend. Warrior's grief was a term Vey had learned at the academy. in a course on combat psychology taught by a retired admiral who had lost 47 crew in the Tessark campaign. The admiral had described it as the particular sorrow of a professional who understands that the people who died under their command died because of a decision that was correct. Not a mistake, not a failure. A correct decision that cost lives because the alternative would have cost more. The grief was not guilt. Guilt implied error. This was the grief of knowing that you would make the same decision again, and that making it again would kill different people, and that the math would still be right. Vey opened her eyes. What's happening with the convoy? Compact Liaison Dreshanvar has been in communication with Commander Han for the last hour, Andrik said from the corridor behind Han. He had a bruise on his forehead and a medical patch on his neck that was feeding him something that kept his pupils slightly too dilated. The Cathara initially demanded to know why we had fired a military-grade tactical projector at their flagship. Once we transmitted the graviton data in a format their scientists could analyze, the tone changed. They now understand what the Lattice is. They are, he paused, choosing his words, frightened in a way that Cathara do not easily become frightened. Do they know who built it? No, but their historical archives flagged a reference. The Lattice pattern matches a theoretical weapons design described in pre-compact Cathara records from approximately 4,000 years ago. A species called the Veilorn, for whom the passage is named, was alleged to have developed neural disruption warfare as a primary military doctrine. The Veilorn disappeared 3,800 years ago. The Cathara assumed they were extinct. And now there is a 19-million-ton vessel hiding behind the Athery Shoal that is generating a Veilorn-design weapons lattice across the only corridor to the Cathara colonies. Vey swung her legs off the medical bed. Dr. Pell made a sound of professional outrage. Navigator. I need to be on the bridge, she looked at Han. The lattice is still expanding. Yes, new nodes forming every 9 minutes. At current rate, the lattice will extend beyond the Veilorn passage and reach the convoy's holding position in approximately 3 hours. Then the convoy can't stay where it is, and they can't go through the corridor. And they can't go back. The nearest alternative route to the Athery colonies is a 14-day transit through uncharted space that the Cathara cargo carriers don't have fuel for. That's the situation. Vey stood. The deck tilted slightly, then steadied. The sand in her head shifted but did not clear. I can navigate the corridor again. I've been through it once. I know the null paths. I know how the lattice shifts. I can do it faster the second time. You nearly died the first time. 3 people did die the first time. If the lattice reaches the convoy, 52,000 more will. She met Han's eyes. And the source vessel is still behind the shoal. If we can get through the corridor, I can guide us around the shoal and get a direct read on whatever is generating the lattice. If we can identify it, we can engage it. Han studied her for a long moment. The Crucible Dawn is an escort carrier, navigator. We have 96 drone strike craft in the bays and a weapons suite designed for fleet defense. We are not a battle cruiser. We are not designed to engage a 19-million-ton hostile alone. We're the only ship that can see the lattice. We're the only ship that can navigate it. And we're the only ship here. The words hung in the air of the medical bay, and Vey watched Han do the math, the same cold arithmetic of consequence that every captain did, the calculation that balanced lives against capability, against time, against the unforgiving reality that the universe did not wait for you to be ready. Suit up, Han said. You have the con. The second transit began at 1700 hours. Vey sat at the navigation console with a stimulant patch on her neck, a neural stabilizer behind her ear, and the knowledge that neither drug would do more than buy her time minutes, perhaps, before the lattice overwhelmed the chemical countermeasures and reached the same tissue it had damaged 3 hours ago. Dr. Pell had given her the stabilizer with the explicit warning that a second exposure to the lattice would cause cumulative damage. The microlesions from the first transit were still there. New disruption would build on the existing damage. There was a threshold beyond which the damage would become permanent. Vey did not ask what the threshold was. She did not need to know. The math was the math. 52,000 people in a convoy that could not move, a weapon expanding toward them, a source vessel hiding behind a shoal, and one navigator who could see the path. The second transit was worse. She entered the Lattice at the same node she had exited 3 hours earlier, and the familiar dissolution began immediately, faster this time. The neural pathways already weakened, the Lattice finding the existing microlesions and pressing on them the way a thumb presses a bruise. The navigational picture formed in her mind and immediately began to fray. She held it through will and practice, and the particular stubbornness that her instructors at the academy had noted in her file as both her greatest asset and her most likely cause of death. She navigated by touch, by instinct. By the 10,000 hours that had trained her brain to hold a course, the way muscle holds a grip not through conscious effort, but through the deep architecture of practice burned into neural pathways that the Lattice could disrupt but not erase entirely. The nulls shifted. She tracked them. The nodes expanded. She rooted around them. The course changed every 12 seconds now. The Lattice denser, the gaps narrower, the margin for error measured in hundreds of meters at a velocity where hundreds of meters passed in fractions of a second. Andric launched the drone strike craft at minute 3, when Vey's course took the Crucible Dawn around the edge of the Athery Shoal, and the source vessel became visible for the first time. It was not a ship. Not in any sense that Terran or Cathara engineering understood the word. It was a structure, an organic lattice, grown rather than built, its hull a web of interconnected nodes that mirrored the interference lattice it was generating. It pulsed with a slow, rhythmic bioluminescence that reminded Vey of a heartbeat, and its mass readings confirmed the graviton estimate, 19 million tons, 4 times the Crucible Dawn's displacement, hanging in space behind the shoal like a spider at the center of its web. It was also 4,000 years old. The hull showed the kind of degradation that spoke of millennia pitting, erosion, the slow damage of cosmic radiation on material that had been exposed to vacuum since before the Cathara Compact existed. It was ancient. It was patient. It had been waiting. Andric's drones hit it at minute 4. 96 autonomous strike craft, each carrying 4 guided munitions, converged on the Veylorn structure from 12 angles simultaneously. The weapons were designed to kill warships, magnetic accelerator kinetic penetrators, and directed energy charges meant to crack armor plate and gut reactors. They hit the structure. They detonated. The structure rippled. Sections of its hull shattered, trailing debris that glowed with dying bioluminescence. Vey watched the graviton readings and saw the lattice flicker nodes destabilizing, the interference pattern wavering as the generating structure absorbed damage. But it did not die. The sections that shattered began to regenerate, not quickly, not the fast self-healing of the Vranok biovessels that other Terran commanders had fought, but a slow, methodical reconstruction that spoke of a different kind of biology, a patient kind, a kind that measured healing in hours rather than seconds, because it had been designed by a species that measured warfare in centuries. "Hit it again," Vey said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. The lattice was deep in her head now, the navigational picture a dim ghost of what it had been, the course she was flying maintained by reflexes she could no longer consciously direct. Andric's surviving drones, 71 of 96, the others lost to the lattice's neural disruption when their human-designed guidance algorithms encountered the same delta wave interference that was destroying Vey's cognition, made a second run. And a third. Each run killed sections of the structure. Each time, the structure began to heal. "Navigator," Andric said, and his voice had the flat quality of a man delivering a report he wished he did not have to make. The structure is regenerating faster than we can damage it with drone ordnance. We need the ship's main battery. The Crucible Dawn's main battery was a spine-mounted magnetic accelerator that ran the full length of the ship's keel, 1,900 meters of linear accelerator, capable of launching a 1,200-kilogram tungsten penetrator at 3% of light speed. It was the weapon that had been designed into the Waymaker class for exactly this situation, a target too large and too resilient for conventional ordnance. But firing the main battery required a targeting solution, and a targeting solution required a navigator who could hold the ship steady on a firing axis while the weapon charged and discharged. The firing cycle was 14 seconds. 14 seconds of the ship holding absolutely still on a precise heading, while the accelerator built its charge and released. 14 seconds during which Vey would have to stop navigating the Lattice's null paths and hold the Crucible Dawn on a fixed course, exposing the ship and crew to the full intensity of the neural disruption field. 14 seconds at full intensity would incapacitate every organic being aboard. Vey ran the math. She had perhaps 3 minutes of functional cognition remaining. The Lattice was eating her alive, each second stripping another layer of clarity, another thread of the navigational picture, another fragment of the person she had been before she entered this corridor. In 3 minutes, she would be what Orlin had become, eyes open, hands on controls, nothing behind them. "Charge the main battery," she said. "I'll hold the heading." "Navigator, at full Lattice intensity." "I know, 14 seconds. I can hold 14 seconds." She turned the ship. The Crucible Dawn's bow swung to align with the Veylorn structure, 1,900 meters of carrier presenting its spine to the target like a lance leveled at a jousting barrier. The Lattice nodes closed around them as they left the null path, and Vey felt the full force of the disruption hit her like a wave, not pain, not pressure, but a dissolution, a feeling of her own consciousness coming apart at the seams, the navigational picture in her head scattering like stars seen through tears. She held the heading, her hands on the controls, her eyes on the bearing indicator, nothing else, not the bridge, not the crew, not the 3 people who had already died, not the 52,000 who would die if she let go, just the heading, just the number, just 14 seconds. The main battery fired at second 11. 3 seconds early, Andric had overridden the charging protocol, pushing the accelerator past its safety threshold to give Vey 3 seconds she did not have to spare. The 1,200-kilogram tungsten round left the ship at 3% of light speed and crossed the distance to the Veylorn structure in a time frame too small for human cognition to register. The impact was silent. In space, everything is silent. But the graviton array registered the strike as a seismic event, the tungsten penetrator entering the Veylorn structure at its central mass, traveling through 19 million tons of ancient biological material, and exiting the far side carrying with it the fragmented remains of whatever organic mechanism had been generating the interference lattice for 4,000 years. The lattice collapsed, not gradually, instantly. Every node across the 11 light-minute corridor destabilized simultaneously, the interference field dropping to 0 in a cascade that swept outward from the dying structure at the speed of graviton propagation. Vey felt it go, felt the dissolution retreat, felt the fog lift, felt the navigational picture snap back into focus with a clarity so sudden and so sharp that it hurt, the way light hurts eyes that have been in darkness. She held the heading for 3 more seconds, then she let go of the controls. Around her, the bridge crew was returning. Ro lifted her head from the communications console, blinking, disoriented, alive. Andric's hands released their grip on the weapon he had been clutching for 23 minutes. Han opened her eyes and took a breath that sounded like the first breath of a person who had been underwater. "Navigator," Han said. "Status." Lattice is down, source structure destroyed, corridor is clear. Vei's voice was steady, her hands were not. The convoy can transit. Casualties. Vei already knew the number. She had felt it the way you feel a wound before you look at it. 3 dead from the first transit, 2 more from the second. Ensign Tellys and Petty Officer Rook. Seizures. The neural stabilizers weren't enough. She paused. 17 crew with confirmed neurological damage requiring extended medical treatment, including me. 5 dead, 17 damaged, on a ship that was 31 days old, on a mission that was supposed to be an escort detail, a routine transit through a corridor that had been surveyed 914 times in 2 centuries and was supposed to be safe. 5 names that Navigator First Class Ressa Vei would carry for the rest of her career. She was still at her console when the Cathara convoy began its transit 3 hours later. Dr. Pell had tried to remove her from the bridge twice and had been overruled by Han both times, not because Han was cruel, but because the Crucible Dawn's graviton array was still the only instrument that could verify the corridor was truly clear, and Vei was still the only person aboard who could read it. She navigated the convoy through 216 ships, 47 minutes, 0.3 subluminal, through a corridor that her instruments confirmed was clean, no lattice, no nodes, no interference. Just empty space where a 4,000-year-old weapon had waited for the right moment to wake. The vessel of lasting accord passed the Crucible Dawn at a distance of 800 meters. On the Cathara flagship's bridge, visible through the forward viewport at that range, compact liaison Dreshan Var stood at the observation rail and looked across the gap at the Terran warship that had saved the convoy. Vei could not see Var's expression at that distance. She did not need to. She knew what the Cathara had seen in the graviton data. She had transmitted the lattice, the nodes, the weapon that their own instruments could not detect, and the single human ship that had detected it, navigated it, survived it, and killed the source while its navigator's brain was being taken apart by a technology that predated the Cathara compact itself. The Cathara had asked for an escort. They had received a warship whose navigator could see what no one else could see, and who had held the course through conditions that should have killed her, and who had held it 7 minutes and 41 seconds longer than any reasonable person would have asked. Var did not signal, did not hail, did not send a diplomatic acknowledgement or a formal expression of gratitude through the channels that the Cathara compact used for such things. Instead, as the vessel of lasting accord passed the Crucible Dawn, every running light on the Cathara flagship dimmed to minimum, then restored to full intensity in a single pulse. Behind the flagship, one by one, every ship in the convoy did the same. 216 vessels, each one dimming its lights and restoring them in sequence, a wave of darkness and light that rippled through the formation like a heartbeat. Vei did not know what it meant. She asked Ro later, and Ro, who had studied Cathara cultural protocols at the Academy, told her that it was the oldest acknowledgement in the compact's history, older than the compact itself, from a time when the Cathara were a seafaring species on their homeworld and ships returning from storms would dim their lanterns for vessels that had guided them through. It meant, I was lost, and you showed me the way, and the cost you paid is not forgotten. Vei filed her after-action report at 2200 hours. It was 17 pages. It contained the navigational data, the graviton array readings, the lattice analysis, the engagement timeline, and the names of the 5 crew members who had died. She listed the names on the last page, each one on its own line with their rank, their posting, and the time of death. Engineering Specialist Marin Wren, 1617 hours. Sensor Technician Holly Adair, 1619 hours. Crewman Second Class Pieter Goss, 1621 hours. Ensign Yale Tellys, 1712 hours. Petty Officer Aaron Rook, 1714 hours. She looked at the names for a long time. Then she saved the report, closed her console, and sat in the darkened navigation bay of the newest warship in the Terran fleet, listening to the silence of a corridor that was clear because she had made it clear, and carrying the weight of 5 people who had died because the math was right. The math was always right. That was the grief of it. 3 days later, at the formal debrief, the Cathara Compact's chief xenobiologist presented the analysis of the Valorn structure's remains. The structure had been a seed, one of an unknown number scattered across Valornira transit corridors 4,000 years ago, dormant, patient, waiting for a sufficient concentration of neural-bearing organisms to pass through the corridor before activating. The Valorn had not been a conquering species. They had been a species that ate minds. The Lattice was not a weapon in the military sense. It was a feeding mechanism. The disoriented, cognitively destroyed crews of the convoy ships would have drifted helplessly in the corridor, while the structure absorbed their neural energy at leisure. 52,000 minds. A buffet set 4 millennia ago, still waiting for guests. The xenobiologist concluded the presentation with a question. How many more seeds might be dormant in other corridors? The Cathara had surveyed their trade routes for 200 years. Their instruments had never detected a Valorn seed. They would never have detected this one. The only instrument in the known galaxy capable of detecting the Lattice before activation was the Deep Field Graviton Array aboard the TFS Crucible Dawn, a system designed by human engineers, operated by a human navigator, on a ship that was 31 days old. The Cathara Compact's formal response was delivered the following day. It was not a diplomatic note. It was a navigational request. The Compact asked the Terran fleet to assign gravitonary-equipped vessels to survey every Cathara trade corridor in the Compact's territory. All of them. 247 corridors across 61 systems. The Terran fleet had 1 ship with a graviton array, the Crucible Dawn, and 1 navigator who could read it in real time while under fire. Navigator First Class Ressa Vey was promoted to lieutenant commander that evening. She accepted the rank in the same medical bay where she had woken after the first transit, with the neural stabilizer still behind her ear and the microlesions in her temporal cortex still visible on the scan that Dr. Pell pulled up on the display behind her as a silent, professional protest against the entire proceeding. Han pinned the insignia herself, 247 corridors. Vey looked at the rank on her collar. Yes, Commander. That's a long mission. The math doesn't change. Han nodded. There was nothing else to say. The math was the math. 52,000 people saved, 5 dead, 17 damaged, 247 corridors still to sweep. And 1 navigator who could see what no one else could see, and who would keep seeing it until the corridors were clear, or until the Lattice finished what it had started in her temporal cortex, whichever came first. She reported to the bridge at 600 the next morning. The Crucible Dawn broke orbit and set course for the first corridor on the Cathara survey list. Vey sat at her console and brought up the graviton array. The stars moved on the display, each one a point of light with a gravitational signature. She could read the way other navigators read charts, not as data, but as landscape, as terrain, as the shape of a thing's relationship to the space it occupied. Somewhere ahead in one of 247 corridors, another seed might be waiting, patient, ancient, hungry. Vey held the course. The math was the math. The grief was the grief. And the Crucible Dawn carried both forward into the dark.